Chapter 1391. Facing eye in the dark blue waves that seemed to never stop in the berserk sea, the future was like a leaf, being thrown high up at times and smacking down at other times. In these waters, there were still some pirate ships that were cruising. They were used to such situations and felt that it was as natural as the sun rising. After Catlia returned to the real world, she pondered for a moment before spreading open a piece of paper and writing. She wanted to ask the Queen what happened recently. In fact, before Mr. Fool announced that he would enter deep sleep, Catlia had already sensed the impending monumental change. Whether it was the sudden closing of the doors or the meteor shower streaking across the sky to illuminate the world, it gave her some inspiration as a clairvoyant, allowing her to see some blurry visions. Of course, she was limited by her own level, position, and status. She didn't have enough knowledge of what had happened, and she was unable to grasp what exactly had caused Mr. Fool to choose to sleep. All she could do was ask Queen Mystic Bernadette, who had long advanced to the level of an angel and led a mysterious organization while being in control of many powerful sealed artifacts. Just as Catlia summoned the messenger and took out the letter she had written, she was taken aback. At that moment, a purple light was accentuated in her eyes. It became extremely saturated and slowly flowed like a river. She felt that Mr. Fool had entered a deep sleep. Unconcealable hesitation, confusion, and sadness arose in the Admiral of Star's heart. For some reason, she felt an inexplicable palpitation, and 2 drops of tears unknowingly slid down her face. She seemed to understand something, yet nothing. She only knew that it was unknown how much time it would take for Mr. Fool to wake up from his slumber. Taking off the heavy glasses on her nose bridge, Catlia wiped the corners of her eyes, allowing her emotions to return to normal. She walked to the window and looked at the deck. Frank Lee warmly invited the crew to taste his newly brewed beer, but none of the pirates dared to try it. Thankfully, I sent Sealf to the Queen ahead of time. Now, all I need to do is watch over Frank. Without Mr. Fool's watch, I have to be more careful and pay more attention to him. Yes, I have to find something for Frank to do other than research. He's a first mate, so he can't always be working on something else. Catlia thought with a heavy expression. After considering how to deal with Frank, as well as how to reorganize the small number of pirates from the Earth and Moon pathway onto other ships, and not frequently interact with Frank, Catlia focused her focus on the hidden sage. Although she was already one of the 10 pillars of the Moses ascetic order, due to her background and the influence of the hidden sage, she had never received the trust of the president and the other higher-ups. She could only be an ostracized person who teetered on the periphery of the organization who had her own circle and respective faction. From a certain perspective, her relationship with the Moses ascetic order was closer to that of a partner. On the one hand, she needed a faction and a powerhouse to project her will over the 5 seas. On the other hand, she yearned to obtain corresponding knowledge and materials. And to obtain the information regarding the hidden sage that represented a deity suddenly coming to life and confirming his current state would necessarily require her to become a core member of the Moses ascetic order. With my present identity, there's no problem with me participating in the internal decisions of the Moses ascetic order. Only by truly participating in these will I be able to come into contact with more information and elevate my own status. However, this will be rather dangerous. Even if the hidden sage's condition isn't right, and doesn't interfere with the Moses ascetic order's operations, the other higher-ups will also be subjected to the infringement of interests and be in constant suspicion. They will counterattack to a certain degree. There are at least 2 of the 10 pillars that I can't see through, making me instinctively feel danger, and confirming the state of the hidden sage will be even more dangerous. If anything goes wrong, I'll immediately be corrupted and eroded by him. The more Catlia thought about it, the more she felt that the mission given by Mr. Fool was difficult. She had always been teetering at the periphery of the Moses ascetic order with her identity as a pirate. In fact, she had her worries about this matter. She was afraid that if she went too deep into the organization's internal affairs, it would expose the fact that she was still in contact with Queen Mystic. She was afraid that the other 10 pillars would one day suddenly point her out as a spy and eliminate her on the spot. At that moment, Cadlia even wanted to abandon Mr. Fool's mission and identity as one of the 10 pillars of the Moses ascetic order. She wished to return to the dawn and return to the Queen's side. That way, she wouldn't need to worry about this matter anymore. If there were any problems, the Queen would be able to stop them. Ever since she left the dawn, she had to shoulder everything by herself. Cadlia had always felt exhausted as her shoulders remained heavy. However, this thought was quickly given up by Cadlia. She sighed softly. She understood that she would never be able to return to the time when she was a little girl without worries. She wasn't only responsible for her own life, but also the fate of Frank, Heath, Nina, and the other crew members. Furthermore, she had predicted the arrival of the apocalypse. She hoped that she could become the Queen's most powerful helper and do something for this world. Cadlia closed her eyes and muttered to herself, then face it. To truly integrate into the Moses ascetic order and gather the relevant information. After making this decision, Cadlia no longer concealed her strength. She raised her hands and used a fairy tale magic. In the eyes of the surrounding pirate ship crew, the future and its fleet became illusory at the same time, turning into countless bubbles. The bubbles reflected a dreamy color under the light's illumination. Then, they slowly melted into the sea. Just like that, the future and its fleet disappeared from everyone's eyes. Many knowledgeable pirates were first shocked and stunned. Then, they had a thought: a new queen over the seas has been born. Queen of Stars. Backlund, in a particular house. Zio, who had yet to sort out her thoughts after returning to the real world, saw Furz's figure appear in front of her as she shouted, "That mission of yours is too dangerous." Zio was taken aback as she instinctively pointed out a problem. "You didn't knock." This was the worst part of living together with a demigod of the apprentice pathway. Furz first reflected on herself for a second before confidently saying, "You didn't close the door." She pointed at the ajar bedroom door. "I actually didn't close the door." "That's right. This was a last-minute gathering. I wasn't prepared for it before the matter." Zio opened her mouth, but she couldn't say a word. Both of them looked at each other speechlessly for a long time, but none of them broke the silence. Finally, Furz decided to forget the accusation and focused on the mission itself. A mission that involves Sequence 1 and a uniqueness is too dangerous. With that said, she recalled that Zio had already accepted Mr. Fool's gift. Her eyes reddened uncontrollably as she couldn't help but mumble, "Remember to get my help. At the very least, I can help you escape." To them, the things they experienced before had involved very few matters at the Sequence 1 level. Apart from Mr. Fool and the world Gehrman Sparrow, at most it was them being watched by he who must not be named. At other times, they would at most do trivial matters at the periphery of corresponding matters. They had never faced an enemy that could be addressed as him. Therefore, when she thought of how her friend's mission involved Sequence 1 beyond her characteristic, or even a uniqueness and true deity, Furz couldn't help but feel nervous and worried. Zio smiled and said, "I'm just seeking clues and investigating the truth. It's not like I need to face them directly." She paused for a second and said, "The apocalypse is approaching. We have to do something. Look, even Mr. Fool has fallen into a deep sleep. What's more, trivial figures like us. If I didn't quickly become a demigod, perhaps there's nothing I can do. Now, there's at least some hope. At the very least, I can try to awaken Mr. Fool." Furz had experienced many things and had long understood this principle. She had only been venting her emotions, but now, she had calmed down. She thought for a moment and said, "What are you going to do next?" "Just relying on myself to investigate it will definitely be very difficult. I'll definitely need to use MI9's intelligence network. I plan on finding a suitable opportunity to let them know that I'm a Sequence 4 demigod. In order to not be suspected, I might need Miss Justice to give me some hints and make some arrangements, Zio answered seriously. Furza's thoughts raced. I'll come up with a script for you. I'll act as an antagonist and simulate a lunatic who attempted to advance to sequence 4 imperative mage, and then be defeated by you. As she spoke, a story took form. She immediately sat beside Zio's desk, took out a pen and paper, and started writing. After I write up the story, I'll get Miss Justice to make some amendments and make it appear reasonable, Furz said as she wrote. As a secret sorcerer, there was no doubt that she could prevent their conversation from leaking out. Zio thought for a moment and said, "Isn't your most important task now to write the biographies and stories?" "Ha, that's simple. I've already thought of plenty of scenes, and there's a lot of material on my mind." "No, nothing of that sort." After muttering a few words, Furz placed all her focus on writing a script for Zio so as to gain Mi9's approval. Seeing her good friend focused on her matter, a smile gradually appeared on Zio's face. She then cast her gaze to the ajar door and heard her brother, Dio Dericha, seemingly reciting the ancient Fasak words. This was a requirement for studying law to become a lawyer. Their mother was instructing 2 servants to clean up the living room. Their voices reached Zio's ears, and her expression gradually became firm. Although she had no idea what would happen when she faced the Mi9 brass, and even though she would encounter unknown dangers when completing Mr. Fool's mission, as well as the unknown future during the dawn of the apocalypse, Zio knew that if she didn't do anything or take on certain risks and just enjoyed the pleasant times with her family just like that, she would ultimately be drowned by the floods like most people who were unprepared. And now, there was at least a path filled with brambles, one that had a glimmer of light at the end of it. It needed the realization of sacrifice, and to grasp it with courage. 1392 Yesterday no more in a room beside the Evernight Cathedral in the southern continent, East Balam, Leonard's consciousness returned to the real world. After a few seconds of silence, he picked up the cup of coffee that had turned cold and took a sip. The bitter taste filled his mouth, gradually waking his mind up. "Old man, what happened today?" Finally, Leonard couldn't help but ask. After a moment of silence, Palaz Zoroast replied wistfully, "Error has perished." Error. Leonard almost didn't realize which existence Old Man was referring to. In the next second, he couldn't hide his astonishment as he nearly forgot to whisper, "Amon." This was a standard true god. Yes. Palaz Zoroast's voice sounded like he had aged considerably. To be precise, Amon's main body perished. Leonard wasn't in the mood to distinguish the subtle meaning behind Old Man's words. He asked in disbelief, why was there no sign of it? He had witnessed the phenomena before and after the god of combat died. He knew that it was a change that would affect the entire world and bring about many terrifying monsters and dangerous regions. And just now, the only 2 abnormalities were the doors and windows suddenly closing, and him seemingly forgetting something. In reality, the latter wasn't strange at all. Most people would encounter something similar during their daily lives. Palaz Zoroast's tone sank. He should have perished in Sapphira Castle. Sapphira Castle? Leonard was shocked. The venue of the gathering he had just attended was inside Sapphira Castle. A war between gods has just erupted there. Amon actually infiltrated Sapphira Castle. Amidst Leonard's thoughts, his expression gradually turned solemn. "Old man, Mr. Fool was injured because of this and had no choice but to enter a state of slumber." "Is he about to enter a state of slumber?" Palaz Zoroast asked in return. He didn't seem to be too surprised about this. Leonard tersely acknowledged. "The reason he summoned us today was because of this matter." Palaz Zoroast fell silent for a few seconds before saying, "His choice to enter a state of slumber is indeed related to the previous battle of gods and Amon's infiltration, but it's not because of injuries, but because of corruption." "Corruption?" Leonard blurted out in surprise. Even at Mr. Fool's level, irreversible corruption can still be encountered by him. Palaz Zoroast regained his previous poignant tone, everything has godhood. By relying on godhood to become a powerhouse, one can never escape the shackles of godhood. On this point, it's the same for you and me. Likewise for the fool. Perhaps he shouldn't be called the fool anymore. He is equivalent to half of Lord of the Mysteries. Lord of the Mysteries. Regarding the problem of the mental imprint in a beyonder characteristic, Leonard indeed had a deeper understanding of it than demigods at his level. However, he still had several holes in the knowledge on this matter. Even though he had heard Old Man mention the term Lord of the Mysteries, he didn't understand what it meant. However, at present, he could confirm that Mr. Fool's level had transcended sequence 0 according to Mr. Fool's words during the gathering, and what Old Man had just said, his strength was enough to kill a true god. Leonard cleverly didn't probe further. He changed the topic in a deep voice. Old Man, why is Klein sleeping as well? Are you able to wake him up as soon as possible? Palaz Zoroast's tone was somewhat odd. How could an old and weak angel like me know about matters at the level of gods? As for the awakening, even the fool has no better solution, much less me. Leonard remained silent for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup and took another sip. After a while, he asked hesitantly, Old Man, do you have any way of stealing the artistic flair of others? Palaz Zoroast scoffed. The definition of artistic flair is vague with no clear categorization. There's no way to steal it. However, if you change it to natural talent, there's a way. Forget it. Leonard ultimately couldn't do anything about stealing the natural talent of others to help him resolve his problem. Palaz Zoroast added with a smile, if you can't accept this method, then you can find a natural talent that you want of someone who's very poor. Make a deal with him and give him the money he wants to exchange for the corresponding natural talent. It's a little like a deal with the devil, Leonard commented objectively. Palaz Zoroast chuckled and said, there's another simple solution. That is to spend money to hire naturally talented people to help you resolve the corresponding problems. Old Man, why didn't you say so earlier? Leonard instantly saw hope. Palaz Zoroast scoffed. You didn't manage to think of something that simple? I thought you had eliminated this option before consulting me. Leonard ignored Old Man's mockery. After some serious thought, he felt that this idea was indeed feasible. However, he soon felt a little guilty and uneasy, as if he was avoiding his responsibility. Regarding this matter, I still have to do something personally. Apart from inviting someone to write songs and poems, I have to write a little. With this in mind, Leonard suddenly stood up and walked to the door. Where are you going? Palaz Zoroast asked in surprise. Leonard frowned slightly as he said firmly, I'm going to the nearby bookstore to buy some poem anthologies. Ever since he advanced to Nightmare, he had given up the collection of poems he had bought in the past, making most of them nothing but decorations. When he became a spirit warlock, he began to collect poem anthologies that were suitable for some spirits to read, allowing him to chant the appropriate parts in a battle to create beyonder effects that worked in concert with him. Therefore, when he came to the southern continent, he didn't bring a single poem anthology book. He only remembered a few of those that he often used in the past. I never expected that, after becoming a high-ranking deacon, I would need to read poem anthologies again. Leonard sighed inwardly as his steps became firmer. Palaz Zoroast had never imagined that Leonard's next step would be to buy poem anthologies. After a while, he probed, is this an order from the fool? Yes, for promoting the corresponding legendary stories, Leonard answered simply as he opened the door and walked out. Palaz Zoroast fell silent once again before saying, apart from writing poems, you have to pay more attention to the besiegement of the Rose School of Thought. Leonard walked down the stairs and entered the streets. He looked at the pedestrians and nodded gently. Yes. At that moment, as he walked towards the bookstore, he felt as though he had returned to Tingen, back to the time when he was still a midnight poet. At that time, he had also walked along the bustling streets, preparing to buy a copy of Classical Poems Anthology of the Lone Kingdom and Selected Poems of Roselle. Backlund, at the Harvest Church south of the bridge. After Emlyn White regained his senses, he found himself standing in front of a window. The sun was already dim outside, and the flowers were flourishing. His feelings towards Mr. Fool's slumber were slightly different from the other Tarot Club members. Other than heaviness, poignancy, sadness, and confusion, there was also the confidence that things would end well. Internally within the Sanguine, some of the marquises and earls were rather old. Even though they lived longer than most demigods at the same level, they were still in advanced stages of their lives. At this time, they often chose to sleep and use similar methods to extend their lifespans. The effects were pretty good. Therefore, Emlyn had long been accustomed to matters regarding slumbers. He knew that it wasn't equivalent to passing away, nor was it equivalent to perishing. He believed that if the correct solution was found, Mr. Fool would have a high chance of waking up. He looked out the window and muttered to himself, "Mr. Fool has entered a state of slumber, and the ancestors' revelation is often interfered with. It's obvious that she can't provide help frequently." After a brief silence, Emlyn sighed silently. "Indeed. In the end, I have to face it myself and bear it. This is the destiny of the Messiah." At the mention of the word Messiah, Emlyn clearly smiled with a self-deprecating hint. He then repeated inwardly, "I can only rely on myself." Just as this thought flashed through his mind, Father Yutravsky's voice sounded behind Emlyn. "Time to set off." Emlyn turned his head and saw a huge sword on the back of the priest dressed in brown priest robes. The sword's length exceeded Emlyn's height, and its width was close to his waist. Together with Father Yutravsky's hill-like body, the terrifying pressure felt corporeal. As a sanguine earl, Emlyn recovered from his stifled feeling and nodded gently. Okay. Today, they would head to the southern continent to participate in the besiegement of the Rose School of Thought. Just as he replied, Emlyn suddenly recalled something and hurriedly said, "Wait for half a day." He wanted to gather most of the Sanguine in Backlund to discuss the pharmaceutical company. Bishop Yutravsky didn't ask anything and nodded. "Come find me when you're ready." After watching Father Yutravsky enter the depths of the cathedral, Emlyn turned his head to the Sanguine that were following him to the southern continent. "Inform all the Sanguine in Backlund to come over. There's something we need to discuss." "Yes, Lord Earl," the Sanguine replied respectfully. After they split up, Emlyn turned his head to look at the altar and the sacred emblem of life in front of the cathedral. It was a simply drawn infant that was surrounded by symbols like wheat, flowers, spring water, and other symbols. This made Emlyn's thoughts suddenly turn adrift. He had forgotten when he started spending less time in his bedroom, spending less time with his dolls. Even his hobby of studying history became more targeted and efficient. This change didn't take form in an instant. Instead, it was slowly formed over time. It was something that made it difficult for others to notice. By the time Emlyn discovered it, he had already adapted to this new life. Emlyn retracted his gaze, raised his chin slightly, and shook his head with a smile. This is the destiny of the Messiah. After returning to the real world, Alger patiently waited for the mission Mr. Fool had mentioned. On this day, he, wearing the pontiff's clothes and the silver-black mask, was discussing the internal affairs of the Church of the Sea God with Oracle Danitz when he suddenly saw a bishop enter. "Your Holiness, the Church of Storms has sent 2 gifts to congratulate you on becoming a proxy of God." The bishop held a tin box and bowed respectfully. Danitz, who had been secretly rejoicing over the malfunction of Byam's telegram, blurted out in surprise, "Where's that messenger?" He left. After leaving the present, the bishop at the door answered helplessly. Although the members of the Church of Storms often had impulsive moments, such behavior was still quite rare. Alger nodded slightly and said, "If they don't view us as enemies, sending a messenger to deliver a gift is enough." With that said, he raised his right hand and gently made the tin box in the bishop's hand fly over. After catching the small box, Alger's action suddenly slowed down as though he found it heavy. He slowly opened the container and saw a book made of yellowish-brown goatskin. On the surface of the book, there was a line of words written in Elven, Book of Calamity. Book of Calamity. After seeing the words clearly, Alger felt a little dazed as though he was dreaming. But very quickly, he understood what the mission Mr. Fool was talking about was. Alger sighed silently and looked at the bishop at the door. What's the second gift? It's a ghost ship called the Blue Avenger. It has already moored at the harbor, the bishop answered without any abnormalities. The Blue Avenger. When Danitz heard the name, he instinctively cast his gaze at the pontiff, Alger. He remembered very clearly that this was the ship Alger used back when he was a pirate. This meant that the Church of the Lord of Storms knew that the Pontiff Church of the Sea God was once their cardinal. Is this a congratulation gift, or a challenge to war? As Danitz's heart tightened, he realized that he was rather familiar with the other gift. It was the extremely sinister Book of Calamity he had seen when he followed Gehrman Sparrow. Help me return a letter to the Church of Storms, and thank them for their gifts, Alger composed himself as he calmly instructed. After the bishop left the room, he turned to Danitz and said, Oracle, I've received Mr. Fool's revelation. I'll have to complete a mission in the time to come. It will perhaps take me a few years before I return. A revelation? Danitz blurted out in surprise. At this moment, there was only one thought in his mind, why don't I know about this? Alger nodded. Mr. Fool is about to enter a deep slumber. However, this will not affect responses to your prayers. Danitz was so shocked that he couldn't speak. Alger continued, Gehrman Sparrow has also entered a state of slumber. After I leave, the church's matters will be handed over to Elder Derek Berg of the New City of Silver. You need to cooperate with him and write into the Bible that the Sea God is Mr. Fool and get all believers to accept it. Our faith is key to Mr. Fool's awakening. You are his oracle, and you have to make an example in this aspect. Of course, he will give you a new revelation at any time and give you other missions. Danitz was a little dizzy and confused when he heard that, but he still understood the seriousness of the matter. He hesitated for a moment before nodding heavily. Okay. After settling the matter, Alger stood up and returned to his room with the Book of Calamity. He looked at himself in the mirror and laughed. He slowly removed the papal tiara from his head and removed the silver-black mask on his face. A few days later, at the crowded Byam harbor. Alger raised his head and looked at Derek, who was taller than him, and said with a smile, You've been doing very well recently. The Church of the Sea God has been running smoothly. Derek subconsciously wanted to raise his hand to scratch the back of his head, but he ultimately held back. He said with some melancholy and reluctance, Mr. Hanged. Your Holiness Wilson, when will you return? Alger shook his head and said, Everything ahead is still uncertain. No one can tell. Without waiting for Derek Berg to respond, he said, You're already mature and reliable. I don't have any advice for you. Having said that, Alger paused before saying, If the Rørsted Archipelago encounters a disaster you cannot stop, don't sacrifice yourself in order to protect it. Ah! Derek was stunned. This was the most important place of worship for Mr. Fool. It was the new home of the City of Silver, so how could he give up just like that? Alger had already expected Derek's reaction and explained with a serious expression, to Mr. Fool, the most important thing is the believers here, not these islands. To the City of Silver, the most important thing is the people, not the city. As long as you can protect Mr. Fool's believers and protect the citizens of the City of Silver, migrating them away in time. Even if we lose Byam, the new City of Silver, and the Rørsted Archipelago, we can rebuild a new city elsewhere and rebuild a new home. Remember, don't lose sight of the forest for the trees. Derek was deeply moved when he heard that. He grasped the crux of the problem. He replied sincerely, I understand. Thank you, Mr. Hanged. Your Holiness Wilson. I will protect Mr. Fool's believers and the citizens well. Alger didn't say a word as he turned around and walked towards the Blue Avenger that was moored at the dock. The ghost ship was a three-masted sailboat that was still behind the present era, no different from before. Alger looked at it and looked at the crew members on the deck. He suddenly felt something and looked down at himself. He was wearing a linen shirt, brown jacket, and trendy pantaloons. He had a custom-made belt around his waist. Attached to it were a dagger and a scepter made of bone. The corners of Alger's lips curled up as he took a step forward and landed on the deck of the Blue Avenger. He then turned his head to look at the boundless blue sea, raised his right hand and said in a deep voice, "Set sail." Backlund, Empress Borough, inside the Hall family's luxurious mansion. Audrey sat on a comfortable sofa and watched her father, Earl Hall, her brothers, Hibbert and Alfred, discuss the recent developments of the kingdom. She watched as her mother Lady Caitlin constantly convened the butler and footmen to make final preparations for the ball. She didn't say a word. She wore a faint smile as she quietly observed this common scene in her daily life. After some time, Earl Hall smiled and looked over. "What is our little princess thinking about?" Audrey pursed her lips and replied with a faint smile, "Guess." "I'm guessing you're thinking about which dress you'll be wearing today, and what kind of hair and makeup you'll be matching it with," Hibbert said casually on behalf of his father. Audrey smiled and said, "Correct, but there are no rewards." She slowly stood up and said to her parents and brothers, "I'm going upstairs to change into my gown." Earl Hall smiled and nodded. "There's no hurry. Everyone believes that you're worth the wait." Audrey bit her lower lip and maintained her smile as she walked towards the door. When she was about to leave the room, she paused and looked back. Her parents and her two brothers continued with their discussion or arrangements. Audrey's gaze froze as she slowly retracted her gaze. She walked out of the room and went upstairs to the bedroom. Susie was already waiting there. Audrey inhaled indiscernibly and raised her right hand. She used her index finger to draw lines of faint light. They seemed to come from the deepest part of a dreamscape. A few seconds later, the faint glow turned into a blonde, green-eyed, abnormally beautiful girl, Audrey Hall. But unlike Audrey, this girl still carried a little childishness and a slight romantic bearing. "Good evening, Miss Justice," the girl greeted her cheerfully. Audrey smiled and replied, "Good evening, Miss Audrey." After the last-minute tarot gathering, she finally made up her mind to advance to Dreamweaver and prepare to split an identity to accompany her family. She would stay away from them and not let the various dangerous matters she had attracted affect them. After staring at her for 2 seconds, she turned to look at the golden retriever beside her and said, "Susie, are you sure you want to follow me?" "Yes, we are friends forever," Susie replied seriously. Audrey didn't say another word. She split off a virtual person and entered Susie's body of heart and mind, which she opened up for Audrey. Then, she raised her hand again and outlined another Susie in midair. The moment Susie formed, she opened her mouth and let out a woof. Audrey retracted her gaze and looked at herself. After a moment of silence, although she knew that their thoughts and ideas were synced, she couldn't help but say to the blonde girl in front of her, "I'll leave it to you in the future. Remember to wheedle to father often and get him to not be so busy. He's not young anymore, so he needs to be mindful of his health. He can hand over many things to Hibbert and Alfred or the butlers. Also, slowly counsel mother and tell her that she doesn't have to pay too much attention to the opinions of others. She doesn't have to maintain a perfect image at social events. It would be very tiring. Yes, don't forget about Hibbert. Cheer him up often and don't let him be so gloomy. He shouldn't complicate matters too much from overthinking things. Alfred won't threaten his position. Alfred, he needs a good wife to stop him from taking any more risks. Oh, why are you crying? We've already grown up. We can't be little girls anymore." Audrey lowered her eyes slightly and smiled at her crying self. I know. After Audrey said that, she pursed her lips tightly and nodded heavily with a sad expression. Audrey retracted her gaze, picked up her cloak, and draped it over her. Then, she led Susie out of the bedroom and into the corridor. The hall below was lit with lights, and the guests came one after another to attend the ball. Lord Hall, Lady Caitlin, Hibbert, and Alfred were already at the door. Audrey stood behind the railing and watched silently for a while. She then lifted the ends of her skirt and slowly and solemnly bowed to her parents and brother from a distance away. After maintaining such a posture for 2 seconds, she straightened her body and raised the hood from her dark blue cloak to cover her face. To her side, behind her, there were bright lights and a bustling din. In front of her, many dark lights formed a sea of collective subconscious. "Let's go," Audrey said hoarsely to Susie. With that said, she walked into the dark illusory sea. Audrey rushed out from the bedroom and cried out with a sobbing tone, "You must come back." Audrey didn't turn back. She raised her right hand and waved it, indicating that she understood. The figure wearing a blue cloak gradually disappeared into the distance amidst the deep, silent darkness. Please go to read the latest chapters for free. In a room of an abandoned castle, sunlight shone through the gaps in the thick curtains, illuminating a pitch-black coffin. Suddenly, the lid of the coffin creaked and slowly moved to the side. With a thud, it fell to the ground. A few seconds later, Isaac Eggers sat up, looking rather lost. At that moment, he was wearing loose pajamas that had been popular in Lone years ago. He resembled a noble who had woken up in his manor. After a while, Isaac narrowed his eyes slightly. He looked around in confusion as though he didn't know who he was. He then saw the brilliant sunlight that penetrated through the cracks and saw the dust dancing in the sunlight. He saw letters scattered on the table, ground, and coffin lid around him. They were like giant snowflakes that blanketed half the area. Isaac got out of the coffin. With a puzzled expression, he bent down to pick up a letter and began reading. As he read, the confusion on his face disappeared a little, as if he had remembered many things from the past. Isaac immediately found a chair and sat down, allowing all the letters to fly in front of him to stack up like a mountain. He opened the letters one by one, reading them one after another. There would be pauses in between as he fell deep in thought as if he was seriously recalling something. The sunlight that passed through the gap in the curtains gradually dimmed. After a long time, it shone inside again. At that moment, Isaac finally finished reading all the letters and completed the long contemplations that resembled cogitation. He looked at the letters that had been stacked on the table and slowly let out a long sigh. Following that, he took out a piece of paper, a fountain pen, and some ink that he could still use. He wrote with a warm expression, "I've already woken up and received all your letters. They made me recall who I am and who you are. I also remember many memories of the past. Your experiences, no matter how complicated and exciting, have exceeded my imagination. It also makes me understand some of the problems that previously plagued me. I can feel your joy, your exhaustion, your faith in life, and the heavy responsibility that you have borne from your letters. I can roughly guess why you ultimately made that choice. If it were me, I might not even be able to make such a decision. From the beginning, you've been a guardian. You mimicked others until you were mimicked by others. Next, I will begin a journey to pursue the past and witness the changes in this world. You seem to still be asleep, but it doesn't matter. I'll write to tell you about the interesting things that I've encountered, the interesting traditions, and interesting people. I think I should be able to send these letters to you via sacrifice." The tip of the golden pen reflected the sunlight as it rustled on the white piece of paper, continuously penning down more content. Backlund, in a solarium of a terrace house. Melissa walked in with a girl who was clearly less than 10 years old. "Aunt Melissa, why here?" the little girl asked, puzzled. All the stories I heard had mysterious rituals held in the basement. With her hair tied up, the bespectacled Melissa smiled and said, "Those are unconventional mysticism rituals." She pointed at the altar that had been set up and the unlit candles and said, "You may begin." "Really?" The little girl tilted her head to look at the bright sunshine outside the window. Do we need to draw the curtains? There's no need. It's pretty good this way. After Melissa answered, she smiled at the little girl while she awkwardly mimicked her usual method of holding rituals in a clumsy and unfamiliar manner. During this process, she would instruct her from time to time and even personally help her to complete the pre-ritual preparations. All right, repeat after me. Melissa took a deep breath as her expression gradually turned staid. Yes, yes. The little girl tried her best to appear stern. Melissa looked at the candle flames on the altar for a few seconds before slowly reciting in ancient Hermes, the fool that doesn't belong to this era, the pool that done belong to dis Ella. The little girl had never learned ancient Hermes before. Although she tried her best to imitate her aunt, she still didn't know what she was saying. The mysterious ruler above the grey fog. Melissa continued reciting. De Mesteries luler apove the grey fog. The little girl recited in all seriousness. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. After Melissa finished reciting, the candle at the end didn't wait for the little girl to imitate her. It immediately burgeoned to the size of a human head. In the large flame, a slippery tentacle with a somewhat sinister pattern extended out in an indiscernible manner. It was extremely slow. The little girl was stunned. She retreated and hid behind her aunt. Melissa pursed her lips and said with a gentle smile, "Don't be afraid, go greet him." The little girl timidly poked her head out from behind her aunt and saw the terrifying, slimy tentacle gently swaying in the brilliant sunlight that shone through the windows. It seemed to be attempting to swat away the dust or was waving at her. "Go, don't be afraid," Melissa repeated. The little girl finally mustered her courage and stood in front of the altar. She recited the incantations she had just invented before revealing a sincere smile and raised her palm. The slippery tentacle whose patterns had disappeared paused for a few seconds. It seemed hesitant and somewhat out of practice. Then, it raised its head and curled up slightly, lowering itself inch by inch. Amidst the sunlight, it high-fived that tiny palm. The end. Please go to read the latest chapters for free. Chapter 1395 An Ordinary Person's Daily Life January 8, you have a chance to meet His Holiness, Barton heard a man in a dark blue bishop robe say to him. No matter how hard he tried, the other man's face was indiscernible. It felt like his face was covered with a gray, blurry gas. Of course, this wasn't an important matter. As a devout believer of the Lord, it was definitely the greatest honor for Barton to meet a proxy of him. This made him so excited that he couldn't say a word. His body trembled as he followed the bishop to the back, entering the hall one step at a time. Barton couldn't describe the hall in detail either. He only knew that it was very grand and magnificent, one that exuded an immense pressure. He could only bow his head obediently. Finally, he arrived in front of the steps. At that moment, he seemed to receive permission as he subconsciously raised his head. Then, he saw a golden retriever. This dog wore a deep blue, gorgeous robe that resembled a curtain. It wore a papal tiara with many gems embedded in it. It sat on a huge throne and watched him quietly. Barton was stunned. This is the pontiff. Barton was shocked and panicked, a strong sense of fear rising in his heart. He opened his eyes abruptly and saw the morning light illuminating the ceiling. Phew, Barton sat up, panting slightly, trying to extricate himself from the influences of the dream as quickly as possible. What happened? His wife sensed something amiss and got up. Barton shook his head. A nightmare. He didn't tell his wife the truth. He dreamed that the pontiff was a golden retriever. He could bet that his wife would say in horror, "How can you have such sacrilegious thoughts?" If that were to happen, he could only shrug his shoulders and say, "Just kidding, I can't bring my troubles into my family life. This is a paradise for humans, meant for relaxing." Moreover, women can hardly understand more profound questions. They have traits in being perceptive to thoughts, and love. Barton didn't dwell on the contents of his dream anymore. He got out of bed and went to the bathroom to brush his teeth. After breakfast, he kissed his wife and children before leaving his residence and taking a trackless public carriage to the working district at the edge of the city. He was under the employment of the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation with a sizable salary. In places like the capital of East Chester County, Stone City, he was considered to be upper middle class. On the way, Barton studied the streets outside out of boredom. Due to not being directly affected by the war, Stone City still retained its former prosperity. Carriages, bicycles, pedestrians, and wild dogs came and went. It was lively and noisy. Barton was already used to such a scene. He didn't have much of an impression of it, but the dream from last night made him uncomfortable every time he saw a dog on the street. It was as if it was the incarnation of the pontiff, one that he needed to bow to and greet. "Holy Lord of Storms, please forgive your penitent servant." Barton raised his right hand, clenched his fist, and gently struck his left chest. After a while, he arrived at the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. As he greeted his colleagues, he walked into his office. After hanging up his hat and coat, Barton relaxed and leisurely prepared some special black tea for himself. He was almost middle-aged, and his energy was dropping. He always hoped to use a simpler method to supplement his body without suffering any hardship. After preparing the black tea, Barton picked up a few newspapers on the desk and wanted to prep himself before starting work. The economic situation in Backlund last season has greatly improved. Another pirate at the level of king has appeared in the Sonia Sea and the Berserk Sea, Queen of Stars, Desi Bay Fruits Trade Fair. After reading the newspaper slowly, Barton took a sip of black tea and started his work. A letter from Vernal. Barton found a letter from an old friend as he examined the documents on his table. He was an archaeologist who had a close relationship with the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. Barton immediately took out a letter cutter, took out the letter, and read it seriously. "My dear friend, my students and I found some interesting ruins in the mountains of Civolaus County. Perhaps they originated from refugees from the Fourth Epoch. In that period of history that we don't know much about, they left the city for reasons unbeknown to us. They entered the forests, and stopped interacting with the outside world again. They existed in the form of a tribe. They might still be guarding something, but it has long been drowned out by time, leaving behind only ruins and corpses. My students and I will excavate this place while employing conservation practices. We hope to find something more useful that can help us restore the history of the Fourth Epoch. I wonder if your foundation is interested in this. Here, I solemnly invite you to send a team over to confirm if our work is real and effective." Going into the mountains, the first thing that surfaced in Barton's mind was not the relics or the history, but the buzzing mosquitoes, the humid, dark environment, and the camp that became a temptation to the wild beasts. He shook his head and picked up a pen and paper. He prepared to file this letter and send it to his superiors. 1396 An ordinary person, S. Daily Life 2/8. After drafting the document's header, Barton was preparing to add some details into the document when he realized that Vernal hadn't submitted any supporting information. Does he think that he can apply for funding with just a letter by simply relying on his relationship with the foundation? Barton looked around the table and muttered to himself in puzzlement. In his opinion, Vernal wasn't an arrogant archaeologist. Apart from being feisty and impatient, he was considered a typical lone gentleman in all other aspects. Under normal circumstances, when one requested funding from the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation, they had to provide a lot of information, such as photos, ancient supplementary documents, and other related information other than a cover letter that described the project. Otherwise, the foundation wouldn't be able to do a review and make a decision, much less spend large amounts of gold pounds to send a team to the project location for inspection. Or rather, could it be that Vernal Fnar was just too careless and forgot to send the information out as well? Of course, with the relationship between Vernal and the foundation, it's entirely possible the upper management will send a person or two to arrange a meeting to verify the information when they see it. Yes, as a friend, I should still help him. Barton shook his head and didn't think further. He stood up and walked to the bookshelf. He then stretched out his right palm and used his fingers to stroke the back of a book spine, selecting the information he needed. Finally, he took out a few books and journals, and combined his various viewpoints to give a detailed description of the history of the Civilous mountain range in the document he was about to submit. In the scientific community, there's a common viewpoint: in a period that's unknown to be long or short, the Solomon Empire and the Tudor dynasty coexisted in the northern continent, and their border could very likely be situated where the Hornacis mountain range and the Faina-Potter highlands are today. There's a high chance that the Hornacis mountain range's extension in Civilous County was a contested ground between both parties. Barton didn't endorse Vernal. He only provided references to show that there were indeed possible ruins of the Fourth Epoch in the mountains of Civilous County. This way, if it was proven that Vernal was lying, no one would hold him responsible, because all of the descriptions came from famous historians. Barton had only extracted snippets in a selective fashion. At the end of the document, he listed out his references: Private Historical Research of Civilous County, Isaac Eggers, Koei University's Department of History lecturer. After completing this document, Barton read through it from top to bottom and modified his choice of words in certain sentences. Then, he took the draft and entered the clerk's room next door. He asked them to type up a formal document with mechanical typewriters. The Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation had always hired plenty of female employees. From the lowest level of ordinary clerks to the deputy director of the upper echelons, at least half of them were female. Barton actually had some things to say about this, but he didn't, nor did he dare to object. He could only choose to accept the state of things. Of course, he had to admit that when he needed to wait, it was quite nice watching these young female clerks busying themselves. At least it enriches the colors here. As Barton listened to the tapping sounds, he mumbled silently. Once the documents were done, he signed and submitted them. Then, just like before, he continued with his work as usual. This included but wasn't limited to the trial projects, providing professional opinions and gathering research materials for the Foundation's papers and commentary. A day quickly passed, and Barton left the company at 6 in the evening. He took a public carriage and returned home after an hour. This was a common occurrence in all the major cities in Lone. That was why high tea became a trend. After lunchtime from 12 to 1, it would be 7:30 or 8 in the evening before people reached home. If not for high tea sessions, most people would definitely be abnormally hungry. Of course, this was only limited to the middle class and above. Many poor people might only eat 2 meals a day. Moreover, couples with the conditions to work would both be working. They would have to prepare dinner after returning home at around 8 in the evening. And the food wasn't for their enjoyment. "Vernal came to visit you in the afternoon," Barton's wife said casually as she helped him take off his coat and hat. Vernal, Barton was taken aback momentarily. The archaeologist who discovered a Fourth Epoch ruins in Civilous County had returned to Eastchester County. As soon as he said that, Barton frowned and muttered to himself, he really did forget to send the information, so he came back personally. No, there's no need to go through so much trouble. The Royal Mail is rather reliable. Besides, he should know that I'll definitely be at the Foundation if it's not a weekend. Yes, I might have been sent elsewhere for an inspection review. With this in mind, Barton asked, "Where is he?" "He only waited in your study for 15 minutes before he left," Barton's wife said. Barton pressed, "Did he say which hotel he's living in?" "When will he come again?" The archaeologist, Vernal, was from Eastchester County, but he wasn't a Stone resident. "He didn't have a place here." "He didn't say." "He seemed to be in a hurry." Barton's wife paused for a moment before continuing. "He looked very impatient." Barton touched his receding hairline and nodded gently. "I'll be in the study." His study was on the second floor, and there were many bookshelves and some porcelain placed there. He wasn't too passionate about porcelain, but he actively searched for unique items. After some searching, Barton didn't find any note or letter left behind by Vernal. He quickly threw the matter to the back of his mind. This was his usual rule. He tried not to be troubled by work once he got home. After dinner, He shared a beautiful time with his wife and children, then quickly washed up and went to bed. In the dead of night, he suddenly woke up and opened his eyes. Ever since the danger he encountered during an archaeological excavation 10 years ago, Barton had gained a sense of awareness, spiritual perception, that exceeded what ordinary people had. He could always sense some movements that others couldn't detect. For example, others might realize that someone was looking for them when visitors arrived at the door, but Barton could sense whether the other party was related to him once they walked down the corridor. Someone sneaked in. Barton suddenly sat up, his eyes wide open. He looked at his wife who was sleeping soundly beside him and didn't wake her up. With very slight movements, he flipped out of bed and removed the double-barreled hunting rifle hanging on the wall. After grabbing the rifle, he gently opened the door and looked down the corridor. This place was shrouded in the darkness of the night, and a faint crimson glow outlined certain objects. Barton didn't hesitate. He entered the corridor and scanned the area. However, he didn't find the burglar. Was I mistaken? Barton turned around, feeling a lack of confidence. There was no sign of any of the rooms on the second floor being opened. After thinking for a while, Barton came to the door of the study, grabbed the handle, and gently twisted it. The door opened silently. Everything inside was immersed in the darkness, resembling all kinds of monsters. After drawing the curtains, Barton carefully examined the interior with the aid of the moonlight, and he confirmed that the interior was exactly the same as he remembered. I really am too sensitive, an after effect of the nightmare yesterday. Barton exhaled and left the study quickly. Behind him, the curtains that were drawn lightly swayed, as if a gust of wind was blowing. The next day, Barton continued his daily routine. He kissed his wife and children, took a rental carriage, read newspapers, brewed black tea, read letters. There's another letter from Vernal. Barton felt relieved and opened the letter. However, there was nothing in the letter. The sender seemed to have forgotten to stuff the letter into the envelope. Has Vernal been suffering from absent-mindedness recently? Barton glanced at the envelope in his hand and suddenly realized that the pattern on it was a little strange. This was an envelope with a commemorative sense. According to what Barton knew, many high-end hotels in Backland and Stone City would provide special envelopes and paper to their guests. It was equivalent to a tourist souvenir. Which hotel is this? Barton put the envelope to his nose and prepared to smell the fragrance on it. It was also unique and recognizable. In the next second, he smelled a faint scent of blood. Chapter 1397 An Ordinary Person's Daily Life, March 8. Instantly, Barton's hair stood on end. Although he couldn't be sure that he smelled blood, his spiritual perception told him that this was the smell of blood. Vernal encountered some misfortune. Just like the archaeological team that I was in back then. No, there's no blood on the envelope. How can it emit the smell of blood? After a brief, extreme fright, Barton stood up immediately. As an ordinary person, he had only one reaction when facing such a situation. That was to call the police. As Barton took the envelope and left his seat, he suddenly remembered something. There were clear rules of how to deal with such situations within the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. If a project were to produce a phenomenon that was terrifying or incomprehensible, employees were to immediately halt everything and report to the compliance department. They would be responsible for the follow-up. Barton didn't understand why he needed to go to the compliance department. From what he knew, this was a department that handled provisions and audit projections for any violations of the rules. It had nothing to do with handling unknown dangers. However, the founder of the foundation, Miss Audrey Hall, didn't make many changes during the internal auditing of the departments. She only added this one clause. Therefore, the higher-ups didn't wish to argue with her over this. And obviously I'd prefer to meet the head of security. Barton muttered as he walked out of his office, heading straight for the compliance department at the end of the corridor. Knock. 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 He tried his best to compose himself and knocked on the door 3 times in a gentlemanly manner. "Come on in." A voice without any uniqueness came from inside. To be frank, Barton didn't know much about his colleagues at the compliance department. He only knew that they were cold and heartless. They acted quickly and easily caught any parasites within the foundation who tried to cheat the foundation for funding. Taking a deep breath, Barton turned the doorknob and pushed open the door. In his mind, the compliance department likely worked in an abnormally dark environment. Everyone maintained their silence and exchanged a few words from time to time, deciding the fate of a project and its principal investigator. However, the first thing that entered his eyes was bright sunlight, colorful decorations, and an open and bright setting. "What's the matter?" A black-haired, brown-eyed employee with no special features from the compliance department greeted him. He was wearing a thick black coat, which didn't seem to be able to withstand the cold winter weather in East Chester. In addition, Barton sensed that the voice of this compliance department employee had a Backland accent to it. Either he was born there, or he had stayed there for quite some time. He isn't cold, mechanical, and difficult to get along with. He even feels friendly. As such thoughts flashed through Barton's mind, he said hurriedly, "A partner of ours seems to have encountered a situation." The letter he sent only consisted of an envelope. "There's no content inside, and there's the smell of blood coming from it." The employee from the compliance department didn't show any change in expression. He nodded and said, "Show me the envelope." Barton passed archaeologist Vernal's letter. Only then did he realize that he was being rude. He hurriedly asked, "I'm sorry, how should I address you?" The employee from the compliance department raised the envelope and carefully looked at it against the sunlight. He then casually replied, "Pacheco Duane, Deputy Director of the Compliance Department, an experienced solicitor. Just call me Pacheco." Without waiting for Barton's reply, Pacheco lowered his arm and said with a serious expression, "Indeed, there are some abnormalities. A preliminary conclusion is that this letter is from the Clough Hotel in the city. I once lived there for some time, and I know that they like to emboss Lavender Castle on their envelopes and paper. Do we need to call the police?" Barton blurted out. Pacheco shook his head. "Not for now. Let's go to the venue to confirm the situation. This requires your assistance." "I don't know that partner." "All right. I'll go with you." Barton hesitated. After exiting the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation and boarding a rental carriage, Barton found the silence rather awkward. He took the initiative to ask, "Pacheco, you're from Backland?" "No." Pacheco shook his head. "I'm from Mid-Seashire. I just happen to have lived in Backland for nearly 15 years. Why did you leave Backland?" "I heard that it's the city most suitable for lawyers to develop their career," Barton said casually. Pacheco smiled and said, "But it's also a place full of competition." "All right, I was just joking. I was once a personal lawyer and partner of Fromiz's Cage, a steam car mogul. Later, he invested in the Backland Bike Company, and I began to work as the company's legal advisor." Barton was suddenly enlightened. "Miss Audrey has a large number of shares in that company. Did you get to know her because of that?" "That's right." Pacheco sighed. "In the war, Fromiz unfortunately passed away. His estate fell into dispute. As his friend, I helped his widow and children obtain quite a large share. As a result, I offended some people. This made my situation in Backland become difficult. Fortunately, Miss Audrey extended an olive branch to me and invited me to East Chester County to work at the foundation as Deputy Director of the Compliance Department." With Pacheco telling him such matters, Barton felt a closer bond with him. He was slightly puzzled and asked, "Why did they target you?" "You were just carrying out your duty as a friend and a lawyer. Those people should aim at the widow and children of Fromiz's Cage." Pacheco laughed self-deprecatingly and said, "I use some inappropriate methods. Also, Fromiz has other friends to take care of his widow and children. As they chatted, the rental carriage arrived at the Clough Hotel in Stone City. The location of the hotel was rather good. The street was beautiful and quiet, and they only needed to walk for 10 minutes to reach the most bustling streets in the city. After entering the hotel and finding the boss, Pacheco asked directly, "We've come to find a friend named Vernal." Through their casual conversation, he had already grasped the general situation of the target. The boss frowned in puzzlement. "If I remember correctly, there shouldn't be any customer here named Vernal." Barton quickly added, "He's a little taller than me, and he looks very well built. His nose is always very red, and his body often reeks of alcohol." He described the characteristics of Vernal in detail. The boss recalled and looked at the attendant beside him. "There's a guest like that," the attendant replied immediately. "He lives in room 309. Under the attendant's lead, Barton and Pacheco arrived outside the room and knocked on the door. The knocking echoed, but there was no movement inside. Just as Barton was about to suggest calling the police again, Pacheco suddenly bent down and picked up a white, soft tuft of hair from the crack at the bottom of the door. No, it wasn't hair. It resembled the condensation of fog. With Pacheco's fingers touching it, it spread out and merged into the air. At the same time, Barton, whose spiritual perception was slightly different from ordinary people, vaguely heard a faint male voice, "Tamara. Tamara." Chapter 1398 An Ordinary Person's Daily Life, April 8, Tamara. Barton ruminated over the name and wondered what it meant. He was no longer the same person who realized that he could hear sounds that others couldn't. He didn't look around in panic, hoping to find someone who was hiding and speaking in a dark corner. There were no signs of him constantly being prepared to grab a wooden pole and rushing over to strike the person. He stood on the spot calmly, observing the reaction of the deputy director of the compliance department, Pacheco. Pacheco glanced at him and said, "Have you done any research in the history of the Fourth Epoch?" "A little," Barton replied modestly. At this moment, he didn't pretend that he didn't know anything about the history of the Fourth Epoch. Firstly, his character didn't allow for that. Secondly, his position was a direct result of his academic background in history. If he had any major flaws in this field, he might be fired by the Foundation tomorrow. Pacheco looked at the door and said, "Have you heard of the name Tamara before?" "I've heard of it." Barton instinctively turned his head to glance at Pacheco. In the little-known history of the Fourth Epoch, the name Tamara has appeared several times, and its frequency is only second to Tutor, Solomon, and Trunsoest. From this, it can be determined that this represents a great noble of some empire in the Fourth Epoch. After saying this, Barton paused and said, "Vernal recently discovered some ruins from the Fourth Epoch." As the hotel waiter was by his side, he didn't directly mention that the name, Tamara, might have something to do with the current abnormality Vernal was facing. Pacheco didn't respond. He turned to the hotel attendant and said, "I'm a police officer in charge of a criminal investigation. I suspect that the tenant in this room has encountered some misfortune. Please open the door immediately." As he spoke, he took out an identification document and showed it to the other party. The hotel attendant was shocked and looked at the identification carefully. Okay. I'll get the keys." As he spoke, he turned around and ran towards the staircase. "You're a policeman?" Barton, who was watching from the sidelines, blurted out in shock. Pacheco looked down at the identification in his hand and chuckled. "This document is 100% real. It was obtained through legal channels. Why do you need to make it sound so complicated?" Barton habitually replied, "I don't care about its authenticity. I just want to know if you're a police officer." Pacheco laughed. "That depends on how you view it." This answer left Barton rather irritated, but as a typical lone gentleman, he knew that the other party was unwilling to give him an answer directly, so he politely shut his mouth. Of course, one of the reasons included the other party being one of the deputy directors of the compliance department. The two of them remained silent as the hotel owner and the attendant returned to the third floor. After carefully inspecting the identification document in Pacheco's hands and matching it to the face, the hotel owner took out his keys and opened the door. He grumbled, "How did something happen?" Nothing was heard. If a high-end hotel was involved in a murder case, it would definitely affect their image and reputation. They might even go bankrupt. Don't worry too much. Perhaps it's just a small problem. Pacheco gave him some friendly consolation. I hope so. May the goddess bless me. The hotel owner retracted his hand and tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion, outlining the stars. Then, he gently pushed the door open. At that moment, the interior of the room seemed to connect to the outside world. A faint smell of blood filled the air. Oh, the hotel owner noticed this and could only use an exclamation to express his disappointment and fear. Only an environment like this can make the envelope not stained with blood have the smell of blood. This thought flashed through Barton's mind immediately. It was only then that he noticed that the furniture was neatly arranged in the room, and there were no obvious wrinkles on the carpet. It stood in contrast with the smell of blood. It didn't seem like there was a fight. A fatal shot. Barton's hobbies included reading popular novels, especially those that mixed murder and love. Therefore, he had a rather rich experience in such situations. And among all the best-selling authors, the one he loved the most was undoubtedly Furs Wall. In the beginning, the one who bought Furs Wall's few novels was his wife. Barton had once read through one of them and ended up being engrossed in it. Of course, he wouldn't reveal this in front of his wife. He would always use an authoritative tone, saying, "These kinds of novels are shallow and worthless. They're only suitable for killing time." Amidst Barton's thoughts, Pacheco put on a pair of white gloves and walked into the room. After surveying the area, this experienced solicitor walked to the desk and picked up the stack of letters with the lavender castle pattern embossed on it. He said to the hotel owner and waiter, "Do you know how many pieces there were originally? We don't replenish them every day." The attendant looked at his boss and stuttered. What he was trying to say was that after having the guests living in this room rotate out a few times, he had no idea how many letters were left when Vernal moved in. Pacheco scoffed and shook his head. He said to Barton, who was standing beside him, "That's why this world needs order and rules. If they used a set of strict rules, replenishing the number of letters to a set number every time a customer checks out, we could have used this to find some clues." "I don't understand what you mean," Barton answered truthfully. Pacheco smiled and said, "Simply put, only light can cause shadows. Of course, enough chaos also means an opportunity." Barton nodded and said, "Yes, Emperor Roselle once said that chaos is a staircase that leads one up. No one knows if he's the one who said that. There are too many people in this world who don't dare to directly express their views, so they can only rely on the names of others," Pacheco casually replied. Then, he picked up the blank piece of paper at the top and held it against the sunlight that passed through the glass windows. "I love dealing with people who are careless." Pacheco suddenly laughed. After saying this, he put the letter back in its original position. The next second, he took out a sharpened pencil from his pocket and lightly scribbled it over the letter paper. Before long, the traces of Loanese text appeared one after another, forming several scattered sentences. "I've been targeted. The ruins have traces of some religious rituals. I took away the items on the altar. It saw me. No. It's always been by my side." When he wrote these few sentences, the archaeologist, Vernal, seemed to be undergoing upheavals in his mood, so he had used plenty of force, leaving the most obvious of traces with his pen. Chapter 1399 An Ordinary Person's Daily Life 5 of 8 After seeing the marks on the paper, Pacheco turned his head and said to Barton, "What happens next will be quite complicated. I will seek the police's help. And you can return to the Foundation and wait for further questioning." Barton, who was staring at the paper, wasn't disappointed. Instead, he felt relieved, and he hurriedly nodded. "All right. After reading the traces left behind by Vernal, Barton's intuition told him that the matter was very dangerous. As an ordinary person, avoiding danger was an instinctive choice. Of course, this was also because Vernal could only be considered one of his ordinary friends. It wasn't worth taking a huge risk and getting involved in this matter. After answering, Barton turned around immediately and walked past the hotel owner and attendant and arrived at the street. This time, he didn't choose to take public transport and instead boarded a rental carriage. Barton's trip outside was considered as a special matter. It was rather urgent, and with the deputy director of the compliance department to testify for him, he could make a claim for the expenses incurred. The difference between spending the foundation's money and using one's own salary was two completely different feelings. On the way, Barton looked at the scenery outside the window and couldn't help but think about Vernal's current situation. Is he still alive? The room was filled with a strong stench of blood. I hope he's still alive. May the Lord bless him. If he's still alive, where will he be now? Where? Could it be? There. As his thoughts raced, Barton suddenly thought of a possibility. He quickly instructed the coach driver to change routes and head home. Not long after, he returned home. What happened? Barton's wife approached him with a surprised look. It was still quite some time before lunch, let alone getting off work. Barton didn't take off his hat or jacket. Without answering her question, he directly asked, "Was Vernal here?" "He came to visit you 15 minutes ago. I told him to wait in the study room and send Wells to the foundation to look for you," Barton's wife replied honestly. Wells was their family's valet. And clearly, 15 minutes wasn't enough for him to reach the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. This was what puzzled Barton's wife the most. Right. Barton nodded heavily. He hurriedly passed through the living room, went up to the second floor, and entered the study. In the study room, the windows were wide open and the curtains were slightly rolled. There was no one there. "Vernal?" Barton shouted, but there was no answer. He jumped out of the window and left. Barton frowned. He looked around seriously and discovered that the books on the bookshelf were in a mess. It was a set of historical books that were split into three-parter volumes. Barton's habit was to arrange them from right to left, and now it was going from left to right. He took a deep breath and quickly walked over to retrieve the three books. After a thorough examination, Barton found that a page in the middle had been folded. He quickly flipped to that page and opened a corner. Scribbled there simply with a pencil were the words, "The refugees of the fourth epoch worshipped an evil god." Man! Barton panicked and turned horrified. He stuffed the book back. Without much thought, he ran out of the study and towards the stairs, preparing to find the deputy director of the compliance department, Pacheco. He wanted to tell him about his discovery and get him to request the police to protect his family. After exiting the house, Barton slowed down and considered an important question: where do I go to find Pacheco? The Cloth Hotel, the Stone Police Headquarters, or the Foundation? After a brief moment of thought, Barton decided to return to the Foundation and look for other employees of the compliance department. At that moment, a rental carriage stopped outside his door as Pacheco Duane alighted. "We discovered that Vernal came to your house again," the deputy director of the compliance department explained quickly. Barton heaved a sigh of relief and replied without hesitation, "Yes, but he has already left. However, he left some clues behind." After saying this, Barton led Pacheco into his own house, went to his study, and handed him the book. Pacheco looked at it for a while, then gently slid his finger across the surface of the text. Right on the heels of that, he took out the pencil he had used previously and wrote beside Vernal's comment. "Call the police." After doing all of this, Pacheco stuffed the book back to its original position. However, he didn't push the book in completely. This way, the entire row of books had one book bulging out. "All right, let's return to the Foundation and have lunch. We'll wait for the good news from the police." Pacheco clapped his hands. Barton didn't understand the reason behind this senior lawyer's actions, but he didn't ask why. He really didn't want to get involved in this matter. He felt that he couldn't bear it at all. Barton then fabricated a few reasons to his wife before returning to the foundation with Pacheco to begin his daily work. When it was tea time, he had just finished an ancient book's appraisal when he heard someone knocking on the door. "We've got some clues." "We need to go to your place," said Pacheco, who was wrapped in a gray scarf and standing by the door. "Clues?" Barton rose in surprise. Pacheco didn't give a direct answer. He spread out his hands and made an inviting gesture. Barton couldn't refuse and went home with the other party. Vernal came again. His wife clearly sensed that something was amiss and went to the door in horror. "It's fine. Just some minor problems." Barton maintained his image as a man and consoled his wife. When he arrived at the study, he and Pacheco discovered that, yet again, Vernal had escaped. "Damn it, can't he just wait for a while?" Barton couldn't help but grumble. "It's all right." Pacheco walked up to the bookshelf and pulled out the book. Clearly, Vernal had read his suggestion, as the book was completely stuffed into the bookshelf. "I guess I know where Vernal is." Pacheco closed his eyes, smiling. Barton was stunned. "How do you know?" Pacheco opened his eyes and replied with a smile, "He accepted my bribe, no, a gift." "But that isn't right either. The most accurate description should be a suggestion. Of course, he might not accept it." With that said, the deputy director of the compliance department walked past Barton and out of the study. Barton followed behind him subconsciously, leaving his own burrow and turning into a nearby street. At the end of the street, there was a house that had collapsed due to a fire. "They actually haven't started reconstruction efforts," Barton whispered. Pacheco put on a pair of white gloves again, and his expression became a little stern. Through the rather intact main door, he entered the half-collapsed hall. Black pieces of wood were strewn across the ground, blocking the lower half of a person's body. The figure was wearing a brown jacket with a red nose. He looked very stocky and was none other than the archaeologist, Vernal. Barton secretly exhaled and asked anxiously, "Why didn't you call the police?" "They're monitoring the police station," Vernal replied without a change in expression. Barton blurted out, "Why didn't you leave Stone and go to other cities to report to the police?" "They're monitoring the steam locomotive station," Vernal replied in the same tone. Barton thought for a moment and frowned. "You have many ways to leave Stone. They can't seal off a city." Upon hearing this question, Vernal's expression gradually changed as he said with a slightly ethereal tone, "I sense the will of that great existence." Chapter 1400 An Ordinary Person's Daily Life 6 of 8 Great Existence. As soon as Barton heard Vernal, certain memories hidden deep within his heart surged out. This made it difficult for him to contain his fear. His feet unconsciously took a few steps back. In the archaeological expedition many years ago, all the nightmares had started with similar descriptions. Just as Barton's body trembled and was about to turn around and run away, the deputy director of the compliance department, Pacheco Duane, brought up a question: "Since you've already sensed the will of that great existence, why didn't you reconcile with the Fourth Epoch refugees who are pursuing you?" Vernal's breathing suddenly became heavier, as if a faint white fog had spewed out. His voice also became louder. Their faith wasn't accepted with their whole body and mind. They still had some reservations. As Vernal spoke, a faint white fog spread out from the half-collapsed house, emitting a strong smell of blood. Barton seemed to come to a realization, but he wasn't in the mood to think. He only wanted to leave this place and escape the danger that was about to erupt. However, Pacheco was rather calm. He looked at Vernal and asked warmly, "You've been visiting Mr. Barton all this while, and writing letters to the Foundation. What kind of help do you want us to provide?" Upon hearing this, Barton was taken aback. If it were another occasion, he would definitely imagine that Pacheco was asking what kind of legal advice Vernal needed. At a time like this, didn't he only have two options? He could either escape and report this to the police, or take out his weapon and fire a bullet at Vernal or smack him in the head with a pole. Barton was full of doubts about Pacheco's way of handling things. With faint white fog lingering at the tip of his nose, and with his eyes that were glowing with gray light, Vernal didn't show any resistance to this kind of exchange. His expression became solemn as he replied in a dignified tone, "Two things. First, bring this item to the suburbs and return in the evening." While speaking, Vernal threw a glass bottle with a slender neck. The glass bottle seemed to be very sturdy. Even when it fell to the ground, it didn't seem damaged at all despite hitting a rock. Its interior was filled with pale white, thin, almost illusory fog. At that moment, Barton acutely sensed that the body of this deputy director of the compliance department had stiffened a little, as though he had sensed something unusual. Vernal didn't observe their reactions and continued, "Secondly, when you are searching for ancient artifacts, help me find similar items." As he spoke, he took out a piece of paper and spread it open. There was a strange-looking lamp on the paper. It was like a tiny water flask that had a candlewick extend out of its mouth. "No problem." After 2 seconds of silence, Pacheco replied in a low voice, one different from his previous tone. "That's good. Huh, don't you think that our encounter was a coincidence?" Then Vernal tossed the piece of paper aside and leaped up high onto the half-collapsed building. He was like a baboon as he nimbly climbed up and jumped, quickly disappearing from Barton's and Pacheco's sights. "What are we going to do next?" Barton turned to look at the deputy director of the compliance department. Before he could finish speaking, he suddenly stopped. He realized that Pacheco was still standing there, breathing heavily. In addition to that, Pacheco's body was covered with thick black fur. His muscles swelled up, causing the black coat to tighten. "Monster! Monster!" Barton's eyes widened as if he wanted to see clearly Pacheco's current appearance. In the blink of an eye, the abnormality on Pacheco vanished. He let out a long breath and said, "We'll wait here. Do you need to pick them up?" Barton pointed at the bottle and paper on the ground. The corners of Pacheco's mouth twitched as he said, "You can pick it up. But you have to keep a distance from me later." Barton blurted out, "Will the fog in that glass bottle affect you? There are things that even if you can't be certain about, it's best to not rashly attempt them." Pacheco still didn't give a direct answer. "It's really tiring to communicate with him." After pondering for a while, Barton took a few steps forward and stopped in front of the bottle and paper. Just as he bent down to grab the two items, his eyes suddenly lit up with a weak light. Immediately after, a pair of boots appeared before his eyes. The front of one of the boots was curled up high. The other was similar to the rounded top boots that were popular nowadays, as though they belonged to two different people. Barton's heart tightened. He suddenly straightened his body and looked forward. There was a lady standing opposite him. This lady was wearing clothes that could be considered as two dresses. One side was complex, and the other was simple. One side was colorful, and the other side pure black. This asymmetrical attire made Barton flare up instinctively. He wanted to tear off her clothes and give her a normal dress and a pair of normal boots. This impulsiveness didn't contain any trace of a male's desire to harm women. It was purely because of his disgust and repugnant feeling toward such a sense of aesthetics. After enduring the discomfort, Barton cast his gaze at the lady's head. She had a pretty face, a high nose bridge, full lips, and a pair of dark gray eyes that were rarely seen. She looked to be in her 20s. Barton didn't feel any amazement. Instead, he felt that the lady's appearance was rather strange. After a few seconds, he finally understood the reason. The lady's face was devoid of expression, unlike a real person. It was closer to a wax statue. Vernal has already left. The deputy director of the compliance department, Pacheco, seemed to have completely recovered and took the initiative to speak. The lady's gaze swept across the bottle and paper in Barton's hand. "What does he want you to do?" Bring this bottle to the suburbs and return only in the evening. Also, we are to help him find the item drawn on the paper, Pacheco answered frankly, putting on an attitude as though he was unwilling to be the lady's enemy. The lady nodded and said, "Give me the bottle." As soon as she finished speaking, Barton seemed to have heard an order that couldn't be disobeyed. He instinctively threw the thin-necked bottle in his hand at the other party. Pacheco seized this opportunity and asked, "You're a member of the Tamara family?" The lady caught the bottle and looked down. "I didn't expect anyone to remember us." Pacheco replied with a smile, "In truth, from the end of the fourth epoch until now, there have always been active members of the Tamara family, but there are very few of them. Have you heard of the Theosophy order? They are them. We are us," the lady answered simply before her body rapidly faded away and vanished.